Good morning and welcome to Church at Home with Rachel for Monday, June 13th. I am in my office. It's getting closer to being the way it needs to be. Hopefully, there'll be some artwork on the wall soon. Um, but one of the other aspects of moving in is we changed cable providers for TV. And so last night, Rob was making dinner because if we want to eat healthy, meaning not die after eating, it means that he does most of the cooking because my cooking is lethal. It's not good. Anyway, so he's making hamburgers. He was barbecuing for me, and I was doing some work getting ready for a funeral I have today. And I came in, he called me for dinner, and we don't have a dining room table yet. We have one. It's still covered in stuff. So we were sitting using TV tables and sitting in front of the TV, and he turned on the television, and it was on the Magnolia channel on cable, which is Chip and Joanna Gaines. And I love them because they are Christian and they've come through some tough stuff and some they've worked hard together, and they're not identical. They are such incredibly different people, different personalities, and they show how two people who are completely opposite can really make a marriage work. And that's, rings bells for me because Rob and I totally different. Anyway, story for another day. But when I walked into the room, and it was just the tail end of an episode, and they had been refurbishing a house for what appeared to be like a girls' home or a place for young women who are having troubles. And on the wall, they had painted, "Your story matters." And that really struck me because I grew up the ugly duckling of the family, and I didn't date until I met my husband, Rob. I was 32. And, life wasn't bad, but it was awkward. And I didn't believe for the longest time that my story mattered. I was wrapped up in this idea that my story has to be told by other people. And I allowed that story or that storyline, that my story wasn't mine to tell, to dictate some really long years of my life when it was pretty lonely. And it was sort of, I was struggling because I wasn't aware of the truth that God made my story mine to tell. And part of my story being mine to tell is the recognition that my story matters. And so when I walked in and saw that printed on the wall on the television screen there, it said, "Your story matters," it occurred to me that maybe I wasn't unusual. Maybe I was like a lot of other people growing up as a teenager, being like almost 6 feet tall, and for the longest time, can't tell now, but I was pretty skinny and I wasn't that attractive, and all of those things that make a teenage girl feel like they're less than. I wasn't the smartest girl in class. I was tall, but I wasn't good at basketball and all those things. I didn't believe that my story mattered. And as I got thinking about that, I thought, what if part of the problem in Canada today, and the US maybe, is that too many people do not believe that their story matters? If people who are so frustrated with our governments that they want to pick up, and go down to Ottawa and strike and have a freedom convoy because they're angry and no one's listening, and COVID hurt everybody, but nobody seemed to be listening to them saying COVID hurt them. Or if people feel like they need to pick up a gun and walk into a grocery store or a school. Or if people are feeling so frustrated that they believe that they need to push the government to overturn women's rights or gay, lesbian, queer, bisexual, trans, etc. rights, or other things that we have come to grow and expect to be part of our lives. If people are feeling so persecuted, so insecure in the securities that they would like to have and they would like to take for granted, is it because at heart they really do believe that nobody thinks that their story matters? As I was working on the bulletin for the funeral that I'm going to have today, yesterday afternoon, I was listening to YouTube and listening to a couple of news reporters, and somebody was talking about the rise of racism, or the acknowledgement that how great racism has become in North America. And I got thinking about the fact that when the Black Lives Matter movement started, it was thousands and thousands or millions of black people started standing up and saying, my story matters. Who I am as a person, who I am as a black person matters. And no longer will I let another person tell me that it doesn't matter. And hence Black Lives Matter. All stories matter. Their stories matter. When that happened, all of a sudden people who had been disenfranchised were becoming enfranchised, not because someone gave them enfranchisement, but because they stood up and said, I have a story to tell. I have a voice with which to tell it, and I will. And they did. And praise be to God for that. But when this side stands up and says, I will no longer be silenced, what happens to those people who were doing the silencing? Maybe they didn't even realize they were silencing other stories. When this voice gets louder, this voice can either get louder itself to compete against this, or this voice gets quieter and turns inside. When it gets quieter and turns inside, do you think maybe the question becomes to them, does my story matter? Or to whom does my story matter? Or maybe they think, the world doesn't think that my story matters. I am not suggesting in any way, shape, or form that the people who fought back against the Black Lives matters, or even the people who were saying all lives matter, because yeah, indeed they do, but sometimes it's not the right time to say that. Sometimes we need to be paying attention to the lives that are dealing with something right now. In this case, the Black Lives Matter movement, and people who are of color, people who are of a different ethnic background, people and everything that stood for, that their voices were starting to be heard, that the world was opening up and recognizing that their story mattered. But we live in this society, it seems like if you can have your cake and eat it too, then I can't. I can't have my own story matter if yours does. And that is a falsehood. That is so wrong. Where in our society did we start teaching people that only one person can be raised to the top? Where did we come up with this idea that somebody has to have power over someone else? That equality and equity have to mean that this is a negative thing. And it seems to me that we should be recognizing that all lives matter. Yes, indeed, all stories matter. Sometimes the stories we need to listen to are those of people who are of people of color, people who are black, people who are indigenous, people who look differently than people like me. Acknowledging that their story matters does not denigrate my own story. When I was a teenager, I did not know that my story mattered. I just thought that, so-and-so's story mattered more. I don't know where I learned that, but it was wrong. Because so-and-so's story mattered, and my story matters, and your story matters, and my husband's story matters, and my stepson's stories matter. Every person's story matters. I come at this from a Christian background. I come at this from the belief, the honest to God, truly from my heart belief that every story matters, every person matters to God. Whether you're a good person or a bad person, a believer or a non-believer, I believe that God cares, that your story matters to God. And when we stop listening to that truth, when we start assuming that one story matters more than another, I think that's where we end up in these places where we have violence, where we end up with racism, or we end up with the isms that become so toxic. I think if we were really to sit down and have a cup of coffee with somebody and say to them, I'm going to spend the next half hour listening to your story with no judgment. I'm not going to say that you did it right or you did it wrong. I just want to hear your story. And then you're going to do the same for me, and I'm going to tell you my story. Nothing will change, although it might, but that's not the point. The point is that nobody is won over to another's story or side. The point is that each person has an opportunity to claim and to proclaim their story, because each story matters. So as you go about your day today, start thinking of the narrative of your story. If I were to meet you for coffee at the local Tim Hortons, or the local coffee shop or diner, whatever is the place where people hang out to just chat in your town, what would you tell me about yourself? What would you share with me that was the most important thing to you about you? Because you know what? I want to know. Because your story matters to me. Your story matters to God. Your story matters to the people around you. Maybe they just don't know your story yet. So think about how you would tell your story if someone were to ask you. And then if no one asks, sit down and tell them anyway. Maybe they've been waiting to hear, but they didn't know how to ask. Because your story matters. It really does. I hope you have a great day. I pray that you will have a wonderful, beautiful day, and that your story will continue to grow throughout this day and become an even more adventurous, joyous, up and down and all over the place adventure that becomes a part of who you are, and then a part of who you share your story with. God bless you, and I will see you again tomorrow for Church at Home with Rachel.